everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Why I Don't Trust the History That I Read on the Internet. Today we are looking at the origins of the stiletto heel. Now, what exactly is a stiletto heel is a bit of a question. Most of the sources say that it's generally a tall, very thin heel. Some of the sources will say that it has to be over 2 inches, otherwise it's a kitten heel. Some will say that the base of the shoe should not be more than 1 centimeter or slightly less than half an inch. And others will say that it just needs to be smaller at the base than it is at the top. But stilettos today are generally defined as a very tall, very thin heel. So where did this come from? Who started it? Who named it the stiletto heel? What are its origins? That is the big question for today, because even the internet does actually admit that it doesn't entirely know, but it makes some pretty strong claims. If you go to the Wikipedia article, the vast majority of it is actually taken directly out of a book called Stiletto by Caroline Cox. Her book, as well as the Wikipedia article, basically state that Italian shoe designer Salvatore Ferragamo paved the way for stilettos by inventing the steel arch. Some historians also credit him with inventing the stiletto heel, while others credit French fashion designer Charles Jourdan. French designers such as Roger Vivier and André Perguia popularized the stiletto design in the 1950s, which quickly spread across Europe and the United States. So basically we have 4 names that are put forward as either the inventors or part of the popularization of the stiletto heel. I'm going to immediately knock out Charles Jourdan because the book is really the only place that I've come across him referenced as one of the options here, and I didn't really see his name come up at all in the articles and research that I was doing, so I don't think we have to worry about him too much. That still leaves us with Ferragamo, Vivier, and Perguia. Ferragamo claimed that he was adding steel rods to heels as of 1952 and named them stilettos after his Italian heritage, since the stiletto is the Italian word for a very fine, thin dagger, and that is where the name actually does come from, regardless of whether it was Ferragamo or not that came up with it. Roger Vivier was the shoe designer for Dior at that point in time, and his obituaries in 1998 very widely proclaimed that he was the inventor of the stiletto heels in 1954. And interestingly enough, there's not a lot of modern claims that I see that Perguia invented the stiletto heel, and I think this is less the fact that he has a possible claim to it, and more that both Ferragamo and Vivier still have surviving shoe companies under their names. So those shoe companies have some interest in claiming that their founders invented something as widespread as the stiletto heel, whereas Perguia, despite the fact that he invented many things and was generally acknowledged as inventing most of them shortly after the time, as a 1951 article claims, he basically popularized pumps as a day wear rather than just evening wear, platform soles, open sandals, and elasticated leather in shoes. So he made a really big impact on what modern shoes look like, even if he didn't invent the stiletto. He was definitely coming up with a lot of new ideas. And in fact, it's through the lens of Perguia that I'm going to be talking about the stiletto today, because I happen to own an original pair of Perguia shoes from 1924, and while I don't quite feel like this is a stiletto, it's awfully darn close. It's 3 inches tall, it's a very narrow heel, and it certainly has a lot of elements of a modern shoe well before the supposed invention in the 1950s. That means that we have to look at all of those claims being made. If a shoe like this can exist in 1924, when did the steel arch come into play, and was it really that important? What heights and styles of heels were available, and what were they made out of? Was adding a steel rod to the heel really the thing that allowed us to have stiletto heels? And most importantly, when did we start calling them stiletto heels? Because that, as we will find out, really throws a wrench in the whole thing pretty quickly. So we're going to attempt to solve the mystery of the stiletto heel today by looking at not just the term stiletto heel, but the materials and the design as well. And speaking of materials, before we get into all of that, I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this week's video, Birch. Between filming and the physical work that I do every day, I absolutely need a good mattress to keep me functioning. That's why I am so happy to introduce Birch. They make mattresses and sleep products that are stylish, comfortable, and environmentally conscious. Their Labor Day sale is running now, and you can get 25% off your purchase for a limited time, so check out the Birch site for more details. Not only do they offer the simplicity of having a premium mattress delivered to your door, but they understand the importance of materials. Their mattresses are crafted with organic and natural materials materials and have been sustainably sourced, and they're free from polyurethane foams and fiberglass, so no off-gassing or irritants. The Birch Luxe natural mattress even includes 8 different layers of organic cashmere, New Zealand wool, fair trade cotton, and 100% natural latex. And by having wool in these mattresses, it makes them both allergen and mildew resistant. I've been sleeping on my Birch Luxe mattress for almost 2 years now, and it has made such a difference. As a side sleeper with back problems, I thought I would never find a mattress that would do enough. But I can honestly say that with my Birch mattress, I sleep through the night and wake up feeling refreshed. And you don't have to worry about trying it out. With your Birch mattress, you get a 100-night sleep trial, along with a 25-year warranty. That means you'll get more than 3 months to make sure that you love it. The best part about all of this is that Birch delivers your mattress right to your door for free within the US. They also offer in-home setup and removal. I love my Birch mattress, and I think you would too. If you're looking for a new bed, check out Birch Living. Their Labor Day sale is running now. It's the perfect time to upgrade your sleep with 25% off a Birch mattress, plus 2 free Eco Rest pillows. Visit birchliving.com/Nicole Rudolph to find out more about this limited time offer. Thanks again to Birch for sponsoring this week's video. Now back to our Perguia shoe. The first thing I want to look at is the arch, or what we in shoemaking call the shank. So inside of the waist, the internal portion of the shoe in that arch area, is a reinforcement that helps keep the shape when you're putting pressure on it. Historically, there are many different ways to make shanks. Most commonly at the beginning part of the 20th century, for women's heels, we see both leather and glued together layers of cardboard that add up to a fairly stiff option. I have made plenty of examples of shoes using both of these methods, and they come out pretty sturdy. And interestingly enough, the Perguia antique that I have is likely leather on the inside based off of the amount that it bends, or it really doesn't bend. It's definitely not a steel arch though. So that begs the question, when did steel arches come into play, and were they really that integral in allowing for the stiletto heel? Because obviously a leather arch can support a shoe that's 3 inches high, so do you really need a steel arch? In fact, the steel arch is something that has been around for a fairly long time. We can find evidence of it by the late 19th century, so the steel shank was invented well before 1952, and in fact there's plenty of evidence of it being used in women's shoes well before that time. In fact, a 1929 article talking about the novelty of a narrow shank and narrow waist mentions that they are accomplished by using a steel arch for the high heel, which it doesn't seem to think is all that novel of an idea, so much as the narrowness of the shank. So clearly, even by 1929, it's a pretty common thing. Now, granted, it is probably not as common as it could be simply due to cost. That sort of metal is still pretty expensive at that point in time, and it would continue to be so until after World War II. A 1942 article talks about what they are going to replace steel shanks with if the price continues to rise and the availability continues to go down due to wartime supply issues. So steel shanks were around, they just weren't as commonly used because of cost and availability, which quickly throws Ferragamo's claim that the steel shank that he invented is what allowed really high heels to happen out the window. Because frankly, high heels, very high heels, existed well before the steel shank was standard. Earlier shoes use wood for their high heels. Stacked leather is also an option, but it's not nearly as stable, so you can't go terribly high and terribly narrow. Wood is usually the best option for this. There's obviously a limit to how narrow you can go before, yes, it will be breakable, but they're usually made out of maple and other very dense woods, so they're going to hold up to a lot of wear and tear even without a lot of width. In 1926, Perguia came out with extreme high heels, and they were 5 inches tall. Those were still entirely made out of wood, and as far as I can find, would not have included a steel shank either. They were claimed to be the tallest heel in Paris and quite well celebrated. And Perguia continued to not only make incredibly tall heels, but also experimented with all sorts of crazy materials as well. He did a lot of metal heels throughout the 1930s, though they tended to be made out of metal in order to achieve really unusual shapes, more so than a really tall height. So he was experimenting with a lot of things. He actually was an engineer in his past and really enjoyed the more technical aspects of shoemaking more than just the visual design. And he wasn't the only person to be experimenting with metal heels and unusual shapes during the 1930s. All sorts of crazy things came out. Some were clear or glittered, different colors, different materials. There was a wide array of options in the 1930s, but of course World War II kind of toned that back a bit, and there were quite a few restrictions throughout the war and even for the few years afterwards, making sure that things were a bit more reasonable. They needed all of these supplies for the war effort, and in Great Britain, for example, Louis heels, the more curvy style, were prohibited, and heels could not be more than 2 1/8 inches high. So they had plenty of restrictions on shoes as well as everything else to make sure that supplies were not being squandered. But once the war ended and and the supply chain started back up again, things started to change. A 1947 article talking about the shoe heel manufacturing system says that another cost in slender heels over 22/8, which is just under 3 inches, is the insertion of a steel dowel through the center to give the heel more strength. So taller heels and narrower heels were coming in, and by the point we reached 1947, shoe heel manufacturers were starting to add metal rods. So odds are the invention of a steel rod inside of a heel does not come down to a designer with a big fancy name so much as a shoe heel manufacturer. It's not nearly as exciting, but that tends to be how history goes. However, there were some very exciting things happening with steel heels in the early 1950s. In 1951, Perguia came out with their blade of steel heel, which is a very fine, thin blade of steel that was actually not only the entire heel, but also served as the shank of the shoe as well. And using steel allowed him to shave it down to a curved sliver, as they said, but it was incredibly expensive. This shoe started at $100 and was usually $100 to $300 in the era, which is a lot of money for a pair of shoes, and they were only done by custom order. So these were not meant to be everyday shoes for everyday people, which speaks not only to the fact that the designer was expensive, but the cost of that steel, and the fact that it really wasn't available to everyone at the price point that they needed. And in fact, this continued to be a problem throughout the 1950s. In fact, one article from 1958 was talking about how the Service Wood Heel Company partnered with Amalgamated Plastics in 1956 in order to start making molded plastic heels with steel rods down the center, which is how most of our really high heels are made today. So they were figuring out the process of that in order to make the product cheaper and easier as of 1956. And it was pretty well available by 1958, which would have driven down the cost very quickly. But it again supports the idea that likely it's heel manufacturers that are coming up with these novel ideas, less so than the designers, simply because the heel manufacturers are far more concerned with making sure that they have an affordable and consistent product that they can sell. They're not looking for a one-off fun design. They're looking to change the industry. But all of this is a moot point when we start looking at the term stiletto when it comes to shoes. The first references that I could find actually are from 1896. Now, they are not referring to a stiletto heel, however, they are referring to the really long, thin, pointed toe that was popular during this time and describing it as a stiletto shoe or a stiletto shape. Now, this only lasts for that short little bit of a year because the style of the extremely long pointed toe does not last for long. However, stiletto heel comes back around in the late 1920s. The first reference that I have come across comes from 1927, and it's in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and they are just simply describing a heel as a stiletto heel. It's not saying that it's a new and novel thing, it's a term that needs to be explained, it just is a stiletto heel. People will know what that means, which implies that it's not the first reference. As of 1928, there is this I. Miller advertisement, which Perguia was actually the designer for I. Miller at this point in time, which describes the shoe being advertised as a graceful stiletto heel. By 1931, the advertisements for stiletto heels are absolutely everywhere. There's a Saks Fifth Avenue ad that says that it is a heel that is slim and sharp and pointed, a G.F. Fox & Co. ad out of Connecticut that is dainty yet sturdy heels. In LA, we have a Bullock's Wiltshire advertising the stiletto heel as well. Now, granted, all of these are definitely tall, thin heels, but they're not quite the stiletto heel that we are accustomed to seeing. They are not nearly as thin as most of our options today, so perhaps this isn't the stiletto heel, but it certainly is a stiletto heel. That means that that term was being used well before the 1950s. But what about the resurgence? What about the true stiletto heel? Well, fast forward to 1952, and Vogue is talking about a stiletto heel that is from a designer that is not on our list, and states that they are high blade slim heels, they're thinner than any we've worn before, and the new altitude record is held by the stiletto heel. So clearly they are defining it as something particularly high at this point in time, not just thin, but by the fact that they aren't saying that this is a brand new invention called the stiletto heel, just simply that the stiletto heel is breaking records with how tall it is, again implies that this isn't a newly invented thing, but this is the point where the stiletto heel does take off. So the articles that I was finding about the history of the stiletto heel weren't entirely wrong on the dates. They said a lot of things took place in 1952, 53, 54, and that is true. It just has a former history ahead of that. And when it does arrive on the scene in 1952, it's not really considered an invention so much as just the current style, like any other heel shape. And in fact, 1953, we see an advertisement from Delme and Dior, which Roger Vivier, one of those earlier people mentioned, is the designer for Dior shoes at this point in time, and they are advertising a stiletto shoe, but it's described as stiletto. The actual title of it is the Cleopatra needle heel, and it is of stiletto slimness. This is also something that is claimed to be a potentially patented design, though I couldn't find the patent for it or anything under Roger Vivier's name from that era, so I don't know if it actually did get patented, but it wouldn't be the stiletto heel that is patented, but their specific design of the Cleopatra needle heel and however they accomplished that particular shape. So Roger Vivier by 1953 is already not saying, I invented the stiletto, here is a stiletto, this is what I did, but describing the shoes that he's coming out with as stiletto in style. And 1953, honestly, there are so many advertisements and articles all over the place talking about stiletto heels, talking about the new heights being reached, the thinness, the fashionable styles. Stiletto is just everywhere by 1953, so it's no wonder that that's kind of claimed as the year of invention for it, simply because it's really easy to find articles for it by that point. It is a little bit more difficult to find stuff earlier, but it is there. And the stiletto heel wasn't the only thin heel of the time. The pinpoint and the needle were also common terms for this really thin style that was so trendy. And a lot of these were still being made entirely out of wood. Some were being made entirely out of metal, and some had a mix. Even by 1957, an article talks about how stiletto heels can still be a little fragile, they are breakable, and they are adding reinforcement to some of them now, which to me says, again, cost was an issue. And even people who wanted the style of a stiletto but the price of a plain wood heel would risk the breakability of those stiletto heels in order to get what they wanted in a fashionable style. So it didn't take having a metal rod or a metal shank in order for the stiletto to be invented, it just relied on those things to really bring it to the literal and metaphorical height that it is today. So in short, the stiletto heel really wasn't invented by anyone. It just came into being through the new styles that were being shown by all of these different designers and so many more. And the fact that gradually over time, a few people figured out ways to make the stiletto better and longer lasting and cheaper, and therefore more available to everyone, solidifying its popularity. And in general, anytime you hear some big name designer of the past being claimed as the inventor of anything, frankly, I have rarely found it to be true. It usually just makes for a really great advertisement.